The Romanovs. The Romanov dynasty is often remembered for its violent end, a basement in Yekaterinburg, a firing squad, the extinction of 3 centuries of Russian imperial rule in a single night. But the biological story of the family is just as dramatic, and it started long before the revolution came. By the 19th century, the Romanovs had settled into a pattern common to nearly every royal house in Europe. Marriage within an extraordinarily narrow pool of approved Protestant German noble families. The same surnames cycling through the genealogy across generations until the family tree looked less like a branching structure and more like a braid. Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra were third cousins through their shared ancestor Queen Victoria of England, which sounds distant enough until you consider that virtually every match made in that family for 100 years prior operated at a similar or closer degree of relation, and the cumulative genetic narrowing across those generations was substantial. The specific consequence that history remembers most vividly arrived in 1904 with the birth of Tsarevich Alexei, the long-awaited male heir to the Russian throne. Alexei had hemophilia B, the blood-clotting disorder that Queen Victoria had quietly seeded into the royal houses of Europe through her own descendants, a genetic gift passed through carrier daughters who showed no symptoms themselves but transmitted the condition to roughly half their sons. For Alexei, a bruise could become a medical crisis. Internal bleeding from a minor injury could leave him screaming in pain for days. The boy's suffering was constant, unpredictable, and utterly beyond the reach of the medicine of his time, which created the opening for Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant mystic who somehow, through methods still debated by historians, appeared to relieve Alexei's episodes when he visited. Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was divinely sent to protect her son. Nicholas, who found Rasputin deeply unsettling, deferred to his wife's certainty. And so, a wandering faith healer achieved an influence over the most powerful royal family in the world that shaped foreign policies, ministerial appointments, and ultimately the political decisions that accelerated the dynasty's collapse. It is not an exaggeration to say that a genetic disorder, passed down through generations of carefully managed royal intermarriage, helped bring down the Romanov Empire. The dynasty's inbreeding coefficient was lower than most others, that will appear later in this list, making this almost the gentle introduction, the warm-up act before the numbers get genuinely alarming. The House of Valois. The Valois kings of France ruled for over 2.5 centuries, and if you read their history in order from first to last, the overall arc is one of gradual biological unraveling that mirrors the dynasty's political decline with uncomfortable precision. The early Valois kings were vigorous, expansionist, and reasonably healthy by medieval standards. By the end, they were producing rulers who were erratic, physically frail, and in at least one case convinced of something that has no parallel in the medical history of any other royal house in Europe. Charles VI, who reigned from 1380 to 1422, suffered from what contemporaries described as recurring episodes of violent madness, and he once killed 4 of his own knights during a sudden breakdown before he could be restrained. And in his quieter periods, he reportedly suffered from what historians now call the glass delusion, a documented medieval psychiatric condition in which the sufferer becomes convinced their body is made of glass and will shatter if touched. Charles believed this with complete sincerity. He refused to let people near him. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent his glass body from breaking. He reigned for 42 years in this condition, with France governed around him by competing factions who used his incapacity as a political battleground. Whether this was the result of inbreeding specifically or some other underlying condition is impossible to say with certainty across 6 centuries. But the Valois pattern across generations, shortened lifespans, physical fragility, mental instability, is difficult to attribute entirely to environment or misfortune. Francis II, who briefly wore the crown as Mary Queen of Scots' young husband, died at 16 after a life of illness. Henry III displayed behavior so erratic that even his contemporary court, which was not easily shocked, found him alarming. The dynasty ended not with a conquest or a revolution, but simply with Henry III's assassination in 1589, after which there was no Valois left capable of inheriting. The line had run dry, worn out by its own narrowing genetics across 2.5 centuries of carefully arranged marriages within Europe's shrinking pool of eligible royals. The Hawaiian royal family. The Hawaiian case is different from every other dynasty on this list in one crucial way. The intermarriage was not a political strategy or a diplomatic convenience. It was theology. The Ali, the Hawaiian chiefly class, operated under a system called kapu, in which bloodline purity was a sacred and cosmological necessity. The mana, the spiritual power, of a chief was understood to be a literal, heritable substance that could be diluted or corrupted by union with someone of insufficient rank. And the highest possible concentration of mana was achieved through what the tradition called the Po union, a marriage between a full brother and sister of the highest chiefly rank, whose offspring would carry the most concentrated sacred power achievable. This was not considered scandalous within the system. It was considered the highest possible honor, the most sacred possible act of dynastic continuity. The Kamehameha dynasty, which unified the Hawaiian Islands under Kamehameha I beginning in 1795, practiced this tradition in a context already made genetically extreme by simple geography. The Hawaiian Islands are among the most isolated landmasses on Earth, sitting roughly 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore, and the Alii class that had developed over centuries on those islands was already a small population by the time Western contact began in 1778. What followed Western contact made the situation dramatically worse. Introduced diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, venereal disease, swept through a population with no prior immunity, reducing the Hawaiian Islands' total population from estimates of around 300,000 at contact to fewer than 60,000 by the mid-19th century, with some estimates going lower. The Alii class, small to begin with, was decimated. The pool of people considered of sufficient sacred rank to marry into the royal line shrank toward nothing, and yet the kapu obligations remained. Kamehameha V, the last of his dynasty to rule, died in 1872 without an heir and without having married, reportedly because he could not find a match of appropriate rank who met every required condition. His sister, Princess Victoria Kamamalu, who might have continued the line, had died years earlier. The dynasty ended not through conquest or coup, but because its own sacred rules, designed to concentrate power, had compressed the gene pool past the point of continuation. The Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies arrived in Egypt as Macedonian Greeks, military successors of Alexander the Great, who took control of the kingdom after his death in 323 BC. And within a generation or two they had adopted the most extreme elements of Egyptian royal tradition and turned them into standing policy. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not a human ruler elevated to divine status. The pharaoh was a god, a living embodiment of Horus, destined to become Osiris in death. Marrying outside the divine bloodline was not merely politically unwise, it was cosmologically incoherent. The Ptolemies embraced this logic with remarkable thoroughness. Ptolemy II, who reigned from 285 to 246 BC, married his full sister Arsinoe II. A move so unusual to their Greek subjects that it earned him the epithet Philadelphus, sibling lover, which the Egyptians meant as a mark of divine legitimacy, and the Greeks found shocking enough to comment on extensively. But Philadelphus was only the beginning. Across the dynasty's 3-century run, full brother-sister marriages became the consistent pattern rather than the exception, generation after generation, with the family tree folding back on itself so completely that by the later Ptolemaic period scholars estimate some individuals carried inbreeding coefficients approaching 0.25, a number equivalent to what you would expect from the child of a parent and half-sibling union. Not from a single union, but from the accumulated compression of multiple consecutive generations of sibling marriage. Cleopatra VII, the famous last queen, was herself a product of this system and continued it, ruling alongside her brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV in succession. Though her relationship with those brothers involved rather more political murder than most dynasties considered standard family management. The dynasty ended in 30 BC when Octavian's forces defeated the combined armies of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and Cleopatra chose suicide over the indignity of a Roman triumph. The late Ptolemies had shown increasingly erratic and violent behavior across the final generations of the dynasty. And while Rome's military superiority is the proximate cause of the end, the biological condition of the ruling family by that point was not adding stability. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Separate from the Ptolemies entirely, those were Greek newcomers adopting Egyptian tradition. The native Egyptian pharaonic dynasties had been practicing strategic royal intermarriage for over 1,000 years before Alexander was born, and the most documented case comes from the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, which ruled from approximately 1550 to 1292 BC. And produced some of the most recognizable names in the ancient world. Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and a boy king named Tutankhamun, whose tomb, discovered intact by Howard Carter in 1922, remains the most famous archaeological find in history. In 2010, a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association reported the results of DNA analysis conducted on 11 royal mummies from this period, including Tutankhamun himself. The findings were extraordinary and disturbing in roughly equal measure. The analysis concluded that Tutankhamun's parents were most likely full siblings, a brother and sister of the royal line who had produced a child together in keeping with the divine bloodline tradition, just as the Egyptians had been doing for generations. The physical evidence from Tutankhamun's mummy supported the genetic conclusion in ways that were hard to argue with. He had a severe clubfoot that would have made normal walking impossible, bone necrosis in multiple foot bones, a cleft palate, and evidence of multiple simultaneous malaria infections at the time of his death, at approximately 19 years of age. More than 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, not ceremonial objects but actual functional aids, worn from use. He was a pharaoh god who could barely walk. The theological reasoning behind all of this was as airtight as the Ptolemaic version. The pharaoh's blood was divine, a literal inheritance from the gods, and diluting it through marriage to a mortal of common lineage was not merely undesirable but religiously prohibited. The result, repeated across enough generations, was a divine bloodline that expressed its divinity most visibly through clubfoot and bone decay. The DNA study has been contested by some scientists who argue that ancient samples are vulnerable to contamination, and those objections are scientifically legitimate, but the physical deformities are documented in the mummy itself and require no genetic analysis to confirm. The Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs are, by almost any measure, the most thoroughly documented case of dynastic inbreeding in European history. And the reason we know this with such precision is that in 2019, a team of researchers published a peer-reviewed study in the journal Scientific Reports, in which they analyzed the genealogical records of over 6,000 individuals across 16 generations of Habsburg ancestry, and calculated inbreeding coefficients for the dynasty's members with a level of mathematical rigor that had never previously been applied to a royal family at this scale. What they found confirmed what portrait painters had been quietly recording for 4 centuries. The Habsburgs were getting more inbred with every passing generation, and the physical consequences were accumulating in lockstep. The dynasty's founding philosophy was famously summarized in a Latin phrase attributed to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, directed at the Habsburgs themselves. "Let others wage war. You happy Austria, marry." Marriage was the Habsburg instrument of empire. Through strategic intermarriage with the royal houses of Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, and Hungary, the family had assembled by the 16th century the largest territorial empire in European history without fighting for most of it. The problem was that this same strategy, applied across enough generations, meant the family was constantly marrying its own cousins, and the cousins were marrying cousins who were already related from 2 directions, and the resulting genealogy compressed into something that mathematicians would describe as a graph with far too few nodes. The most visible consequence was physical, and it was painted into history in extraordinary detail. The Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, an extreme forward projection of the lower jaw combined with a pronounced underbite, appears across centuries of Habsburg portraiture in a progression that tracks the family's inbreeding coefficient with remarkable fidelity. Separate 2019 study published in Annals of Human Biology analyzed 66 portraits of Habsburg rulers spanning 2 centuries and found a direct statistical correlation between a subject's calculated inbreeding coefficient and the severity of their jaw deformity. The jaw was severe enough in many members to interfere with chewing and speaking. It was also, for a time, considered a mark of noble identity, the visible brand of Habsburg blood, until the generations arrived in which it was no longer a mark of distinction but a sign of biological distress. The Spanish Habsburg branch. If the Austrian Habsburgs were the controlled experiment, the Spanish branch was what happened when you took the same genetic material and ran the same experiment faster and without stopping. When Charles I of Spain, simultaneously Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, divided his enormous empire between his son Philip II in Spain and his brother Ferdinand in Austria in the mid-16th century, he created 2 separate Habsburg dynasties that then continued to intermarry with each other for the next century and a half, creating a genetic feedback loop of almost geometric intensity. The Spanish Habsburgs married Austrians, the Austrians married Spanish, and then the children of those marriages married back into both lines, so that by the mid-17th century, a Spanish Habsburg king's family tree contained the same ancestors appearing from multiple directions simultaneously, not as a curiosity, but as a structural feature of every generation. Philip II of Spain, considered one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, married his own niece Anna of Austria as his fourth wife. His son Philip III married a relative. Philip IV married his niece Mariana of Austria. Each generation the coefficient tightened. Philip IV's inbreeding coefficient has been estimated at approximately 0.21, comparable to what you would expect from the offspring of a half-sibling union, and he was not the worst of the line. The infant mortality rate in the Spanish Habsburg line across the 17th century was staggering. Of the 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg parents in this period, 17 died before their first birthday, compared to a general European infant mortality rate for the same era of roughly 20%. The Spanish line was losing half its children before they could walk, in a dynasty that commanded the most powerful empire on earth. The jaw was worsening with each generation. The physical fragility was accelerating. And at the end of the line waited someone who would make every previous case in this video look moderate by comparison. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain was the product of everything that came before him: the Austrian branch, the Spanish branch, the intermarriage of cousins who were already cousins, repeated and compounded across 9 generations of Habsburg family policy, and the numbers that result from that accumulation are genuinely difficult to process. According to the 2019 scientific report study, Charles II carried an inbreeding coefficient of approximately 0.254. For context, the expected coefficient for the child of a full brother-sister union is 0.25. Charles was not the product of a single incestuous pairing. He was the product of 9 generations of cousin marriages so consistently close that the cumulative result exceeded, in mathematical terms, what a single act of full sibling reproduction would have produced. His family tree, which should theoretically contain 128 distinct individuals across 7 generations, contained only 32. His ancestor Philip I of Castile appears in his genealogy 14 separate times. The family tree had not merely narrowed, it had collapsed into something that barely qualified as a tree at all. The physical consequences were severe, extensively documented by contemporary observers, and deeply sad in a way that the earlier Habsburg cases are not. Because Charles, by all accounts, was a gentle and kind person who understood to some degree that his body and mind were not working as they should. He could not chew solid food. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth never made contact, and he drooled constantly because his tongue was described by contemporaries as too large for his mouth. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. He did not speak clearly until his teenage years. He was bald by 35 and suffered from chronic digestive problems, persistent diarrhea and vomiting throughout his adult life. He was also impotent, or at least produced no children across 2 marriages, to Marie-Louise of Orléans and later Mariana of Neuburg, both of whom desperately wanted to provide an heir and failed entirely. The court's response to this failure was not genetic analysis, that would wait 3 centuries, but exorcism. The Spanish court concluded that Charles must be bewitched, that no natural explanation could account for the condition of a Habsburg king, and Charles himself reportedly believed this and submitted to the exorcisms willingly. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, reportedly leaving behind an autopsy, documented by contemporaries, though historians debate its accuracy, that described a body in a state of extraordinary deterioration. His death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that drew in France, England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and several smaller powers, and which reshaped the political map of Europe over 14 years of warfare. The marriage strategy of a single dynasty, pursued with complete consistency for 9 generations, had produced a king whose body could not function and whose death could not be managed without a continental war. Charles II was not a monster or a villain. He was a kind man who was handed, at birth, the accumulated biological consequences of 2 centuries of decisions made by people who believed they were doing the right thing for their bloodline. He was the end of the line, literally, mathematically, and in every other sense, and no amount of exorcism was going to change that. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.